That gives you an idea. We taught for many years a graduate level, honours level course on environmental ethics to students doing theology, religious studies and philosophy, and that will inform some of what I'm going to say this afternoon. And really we need to look at how we respond to today's environmental challenges and some of the tools, which I think is what you've been doing looking at food this week, or this conference. I think you've done some work on worldviews, which is really helpful to understand where you're coming from and where our ethical drivers are, which are so often hidden, and it's actually taking them out and seeing them that enables us to be able to do something, enables us to actually do something about them. I'm going to give you some examples of Christian environmental ethics, and I'm going to look at where they complement and where they conflict. And I'm going to try and do all of that to give you enough time to have questions at the end. So let's go. Should be fine. First of all, ethical starting points. This is, so I've got a little booklet that's an introduction to environmental ethics, and this comes into that. We have got a lovely apple tree. I took that this week in our garden that we planted 10 years ago that we're very loath to leave. And we found that half of our apples were getting codling moth, which is this moth here would plant, would seed into the apples, and we'd have moth damage. And people were saying, oh, you can spray these trees and you'll be fine. We didn't want to do that. And we found some papers that had done some work that said if you actually put up nesting boxes for blue tits and great tits, you can reduce your codling moth damage by half, because the blue tits and the great tits actually like codling moth larvae for their young. So it's a natural biological way of doing it. And we found that worked. When we had blue tits, great tits nesting near the tree, our codling moth damage decreased quite dramatically. So you have to say, where do you value the blue tits? What sort of ways? And this is just a way of understanding value, which you know some of you will have done, some of you won't have done. And you could say it's instrumental value, that we valued the blue tits because they controlled our codling moth, and that's why we thought they were important. You could say that they had extrinsic value, that we valued them because they were good for the apples, or because they were good for the entire garden ecosystem. They were feeding their young, it meant that the birds were increasing, and that was good all round for the ecosystem. Or you could say it was good because it gave us pleasure, because we liked seeing the birds and it was lovely to have them in the garden, and that was something that was a positive thing for us. Or you could say that they had intrinsic value, that the blue tits and the apples, and indeed the codling moth, all had value in their own right. Now, it's a very simple example, but that is how people look at the environment, it's how people look at nature. They might value it because of what it does for us. They might value it for what it does in relation to other organisms, and something like ecosystem services, if you've heard of that, is very much on that level. Or they might value it because of intrinsic value in its own right. And those are the three ways in which nature is valued. Then it's also useful to think about what has ultimate value. And this comes much more closely into the way that ethics are driven and worked. And I'm sure sometimes with students I would put little slips out on the table and get them to talk about these and decide what they meant. But I mean, anthropocentric quite clearly is decision taken for the benefit of humans. Sometimes different sorts of humans. It can be a sort of economy centric, you know, what's good for the economy, not necessarily what's good for the poor. Or it can be shareholder centric, what's good for the people who own a company, not necessarily what's good for the people who are living around it. But it's all what's good for humans. You then have ecocentric. And ecocentric is making decisions for what is good for the entire ecosystem. So what will benefit the whole? And that's quite distinctively different from biocentric. And biocentric is looking at what is good for each individual organism. And those are different. I mean, as an example, a very simple example, the island of Uist is known for its birds, particularly puffins, but other wild birds. And somebody, somewhere along the line, decided to introduce hedgehogs to Uist. Hedgehogs are not native to Uist, but the hedgehogs thought it was a great place to live, and particularly because they could have lots of eggs from the ground nesting birds. And the hedgehogs began to thrive and the birds began to decrease. So the conservation people, local conservation society, decided they would cull the hedgehogs. And by culling the hedgehogs, they would try to eradicate them from the island, and that would mean that it would be great. You would have the puffins would be able to increase again, all would be good. The British Hedgehog Preservation Society were not very pleased about this, and they used to go up. I'm a member, and I used to see these things. They would go up and try and rescue the hedgehogs, and they would trap them and try and release them on the mainland, and the conservationists saying, oh, that won't work, they won't survive when you take them. But in fact, they were able to show that they did. You probably realise that hedgehogs on the mainland of Britain are decreasing rapidly. And so actually there began to be a changed approach, and they, instead of culling, started trapping, and then those hedgehogs were released on the mainland. Now, can you see who was ecocentric, who was biocentric in that whole story? The conservationists were ecocentric. Conservationists tend to be ecocentric, and we're looking at the world of puffins and how to keep the ecosystem healthy. The hedgehog people were the biocentric people, concerned for each individual hedgehog. Both are important. New Zealand is being overrun by invasive European mammals and, in fact, Australian marsupials. And the only way they can save their ground nesting birds, which is their main ecology, is by culling. That's very, very controversial to some people. Those two things, and as we go along, we'll see different ways in which they're taken. But those two things are quite useful to know. Both are important ethics, both are slightly different. But I think there's another ethic, and I call it theocentric. And theocentric ethics are ethics taken on the basis of what is honouring to a creator God. And with theocentric ethics, I like to see that you actually take all three of those into account as you're looking at what is honouring to God, what will honour God the most. Now, I was talking at lunchtime, people were saying that in Christian ethics quite often, and in Christian churches quite often, environment is seen as a bit of a peripheral thing. And that's partly because Christian ethics and indeed Christian thinking has tended to be theocentric, but in an anthropocentric way, if you like. So anthropocentric is seen as the big thing in terms of caring for this world. And as soon as you make that the main bit of ethics, so you have medical ethics, you have all sorts of different ethics, you then make ecocentric and biocentric a bit of an externality. And once they become an externality, they become peripheral. Economics does the same thing. Economics calls environment as an externality, and traditional economics just hypothesizes that there's limited resources. Of course, there isn't limitless resources. There's only one planet. And that's been a big weakness in economics and been part of the reason we're in the crisis that we're in. So that is why environment is often a bit peripheral in Christian ethics, and why we're very keen to see that put into a more integral way, a more holistic way, and to look at theocentric ethics as how, amongst all of those things, we can honour a creator God. I'm going to look at three secular ethics, very briefly. I'll only give you kind of thumbnail sketches of them, but they're three key ones to look at. We're looking at the land ethic, deep ecology, and sort of ecofeminism and eco-spirituality. And then I'll look at some Christian ethics. These are from a secular kind of a perspective, not entirely so, but a secular perspective, or a non-Christian, less Christian perspective. First of all, the land ethic, Aldo Leopold. He was a forester who worked for the US Forestry Service in the first half of the last century. And he wrote at a time when there's very little environmental legislation, and he was very keen on the concept of the land. And he primarily saw that as something used for human use, but he saw it a lot more ecologically than an awful lot of the people around him. And in 1947, he published something called the Sand County Almanac, which is easily available in paperback, it's easily available on Kindle, is well worth reading as a classic in the early stages of environmental ethics. And he took the kind of the American sort of phrase, the land of the free, and actually took it to it's not simply being humans, but being the entire land community. Soil, water, plants, animals, a complete ecosystem. And he said you needed to realise that all these organisms were in a symbiotic relationship with each other, and that land had value for its own sake. It rings the bells, intrinsic value. It has value in its own sake. And he said that different parts of the ecosystem compete for a place in community, and you needed ethics to work out how you got cooperation. And he had this idea of a community, the land as a community, not meaning people community, but as it's a kind of a word for an ecosystem. And he said the land ethic enlarges those boundaries of community to include the whole biosphere and geosphere. So this is very much ecocentric ethics, very much an ethic where you're saying, how does everything work together? How does the land work together? How do you have that cooperation between different elements to help them to all be fruitful? So that's the land ethic and Aldo Leopold. Later on in the century, really second half of the 20th century, we had a much deeper form of ecology called deep ecology by RNA Ness. And he was from the University of Oslo, and he died just 10 years ago. And he was a philosopher. And he was writing primarily in the 1970s and 80s. And he developed the idea of deep ecology, or ecosophy, philosophy of ecology. And he talked about the difference between deep ecology and shallow ecology. And he had an idea of really biospherical, he called it egalitarianism. He said that every single organism had value and had kind of equal value. There's very egalitarian things. So, a wasp would have as much value as, the extreme interpretation of him would say a wasp has as much value as a human. That's perhaps the extreme interpretation of him. But that was how he looked at it. Everything has value. We have no right to say we're more valuable than any other bit of the ecosystem. And he was deeply biocentric in that. Each organism is important. And he criticised what he saw as shallow ecology, which was really the burgeoning at that time conservation movement, which of course was much more ecocentric, much more saying how do whole ecosystems work together, also looking, particularly in Europe, at how do they work together in traditional land management settings. I spent my teens and 20s coppicing woodlands, which is a very traditional way of managing woodlands that helps wildlife. But of course, chopping down trees. I had a New Zealand friend who couldn't work out why we thought this was good for the environment. But he would see conservation as kind of shallow ecology, because you weren't really valuing every individual organism. And what he was talking about was a deep ecology. And it was taken forward by another couple of academics called Deval and Sessens, and they talked about self-realization, a kind of identification, is that moment when you're in the middle of nature and you suddenly realize you're a part of it. Have you ever had that experience? You know, you're in the middle of a wood or a mountain or something, and you suddenly think, I'm a part of this, all of this. I'm biological too. This is something where I kind of feel I belong. And that identification, De Waal and Sessions took as a self-realization, and a realization with like only one speck in this entire ecology. And so it was very strong on intrinsic value, very strong on diversity, very strong on humans not being privileged. And so his thesis was that we needed a dramatic and rapid decrease in human population, or decrease in the increase in human population, if you like. And the problem, the basic problem with ecology was humans, and we needed to pull back from interfering with the natural world, and we needed to change our economic, technological, ideological structures, very, very radical in its teaching, and that actually we ought to move towards life quality rather than trying always to go to a higher standard of living. And that's that was its thesis. So a very radical statement, a very deeply biocentric statement. I remember taking one tutorial at Oxford with a student who looked at deep ecology, and actually pointed out the flaw in it was that it was saying, you know, each organism needed to have the freedom to be who they were. And they said, well, if that was the case, humans ought to have the freedom to be who we are and consume everything, destroy the planet, kind of go extinct, and then everything. And I'd said I could see a little bit of logic in that, but the very fact that he's asking humans to pull back means that humans actually are different to the rest of the environment, which is quite an interesting thought with deep ecology. But those two, it really, the land ethic and deep ecology are two of the primary 20th century environmental ecology ethics, if you like, that pop up in different forms all over the place, and you will find them. Then going on to Joanna Macy and eco-spirituality, ecofeminism. Joanna comes from the west coast of Canada, and was very, very influenced by three things: deep ecology, Buddhism, and also general systems theory. And she has advocated moving from industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society. And she's taken, if you like, the deep ecology ethic and fused it with a kind of Buddhist ethic to kind of emphasize the interconnectedness of everything, which is a very sort of Eastern idea, and also have a spirituality about it. And that idea of self-realization, of realizing you're just one speck on this amazing universe, leading to a shift in your thinking to an ecological self. And so that's where she goes, that's where she takes it forward. And I find it so often people want to put together workshops in a Christian context, and they say, oh, let's do something with Joanna Macy and let's do these self-realizations. And there's a lot to be learnt from it. Also, I'd probably do it in a slightly different way in a Christian context. So if that gives you a very quick whiz through secular environmental ethics in all of probably 20 minutes, let's see how it links up with some Christian environmental ethics. How do they connect together? Well, perhaps to start with, I'm going to bring up somebody called Lynne White. Have people heard of Lynne White before? Have most of you heard of Lynne White before? Yeah, lovely. I'll do it quite quickly then. He was a medieval historian, and he wrote an article in Science back in 1967 where he put the roots of our current ecological crisis firmly into medieval Christian Europe, and he based it on his interpretation of dominion in Genesis. But what is often missed on Lynne White is that he did advocate a spiritual solution to the modern crisis. He said he thought Buddhism was quite a good idea, but actually in the West that wasn't going to really take because it was a Christian-based culture. And he advocated taking St. Francis and developing an environmental ethic based on Franciscan theology. And that's very often missed, that he didn't actually say, let's throw Christianity out altogether, but he advocated that. However, his writing was very influential and convinced many people that Christianity was an anti-environmental religion, if you like, and that still swirls around a little bit. I have to be said, quite probably then, and in many places now, that you don't have to go very far to say, well, actually, are Christians that environmental? Are we caring that much about the environment? And that's a challenge to us, and I think it remains a challenge with Lynne White. Someone who did quite a lot of thinking about what was Lynne White talking about, what was going on about, was somebody called Paul Sant Mir. Have you heard of Paul Sant Mir? Have you come across him before? And he wrote a book called The Travail of Nature, the Ambiguous Ecological Promise of Christian Theology. This is towards the end of the 20th century. And he picked out two motifs, a spiritual motif and an ecological motif. Now, as I explain these, I think it's important to say that the spiritual motif, the ecological motif doesn't say spiritual is bad. It's just trying to explain two different ways of looking at things. The spiritual motif has its roots, as we had in the last talk, in Neoplatonism. That was very, very strong at the time of the early church. You do find it in some of Paul's writings. You find a Neoplatonic strand in there. And you find it very strongly in many of the early church fathers. I mean, Augustine, Jerome, others. And the idea in Neoplatonism is basically that there is this higher, idealistic, beautiful, it's very Greek, beautiful, idealized spiritual realm. And that this world is imperfect and not particularly nice. And that as humans, I mean, I'm overstating it to explain it, as humans we need to somehow try to transcend this world to get to that higher spiritual realm. Now, the difficulty with that is that former bit, that this world is in some way nasty and imperfect, because it has got an awful lot that's a problem with it. And I was at but it has got awful lot of problems with it. But actually, fundamentally, it's a creation made by God. And at its most extreme, spiritual motif slid into the heresies of Gnosticism and, to some extent, Manichaeism. So that's the spiritual motif. The ecological motif is the idea, comes very much more from the Hebrew understanding, the Hebrew Bible, and you find it in the New Testament very strongly as well. The idea that this world is something created by God and is fundamentally good, and that you derive your understanding of this world from the fact that God is creator. And both those motifs Sant Mir traced through Christian history. He found Neoplatonism came at different times. It came with the early church fathers, it came in the Renaissance, and then it came in the early Enlightenment period. In fact, there was a group called the Cambridge Platonists at the end of the 17th century. Many of the ideas of Platonism are wonderful. I'm not saying this; it's a bad thing. It's more nuanced than that. But that idea of if you like, that the whole aim of Christianity was not to be part of this world was perhaps the negative strand of it. It did have some positives. In the early industrial era, people living horrendous lives, working horrendous hours in the factories in horrendous conditions. The idea that there was a better place was actually quite a positive thing for people to look toward. It was very prevalent in North America in the slave trade, because people were living horrendous lives and it promised something better. But it had that huge downside of a very negative view of this creation. The ecological motif you would find through different strands. I mean, the Benedictines were very ecological. Francis was quite ecological. The Puritans were very ecological. You find the Puritan theology very Hebraic, and Hebrew theology, Jewish theology, is quite ecological, and it goes through at different places, different times. So, on the basis of that, and the basis of this challenge of how does Christianity respond to the challenges of environment, the challenges that maybe has it been as good on environment as it should be, there has been a whole range of responses. I've put some of the popular books up, but there are a whole pile of others too. The key one has been the stewardship ethic, which I'm sure you'll have done some work on already in this conference, but the idea it tends often to go back to Genesis 1 and 2, where the relationships between God, people, and the rest of creation are sort of set out. Two key ones: that the earth was created by God, and that it was seen to be good. Good is mentioned 7 times in Genesis 1, which is obviously a perfect number. Pope Francis on Laudato Si put quite a strong emphasis on the stewardship ethic. And the stewardship ethic you find going right through into many secular ethics as well. This latest thing on food that's come out uses stewardship ethic. My previous principal at Jesus College, John Krebs, put out a Nuffield report in, I think it was way back, it's about 2007, and it was a health report of how you could use stewardship ethic to shift health thinking, to work towards greater community health. I mean, one easy example was when you serve in a restaurant a burger, the default tends to be with chips, and or fries. You have to ask if you want salad. If you change the culture so that the default is with salad, and you have to ask if you want fries, you begin to kind of develop a culture of stewardship. And it's a very silly example, but many ways like that. So stewardship ethic is used in the secular realm quite a lot, of how do we actually manage the world for good. I'll just take 2 words from Genesis. The word rule over, which the King James was dominion. So this is Lynne White's dominion. You could say dominion sounds like dominate and do what you like with. It's actually also used with King Solomon when he's given rule over Israel. And obviously he was given rule in terms of responsibility. He was supposed to be a just king. He was supposed to rule wisely. He was given wisdom. So you can say at the rule of an Israelite king, it's about having that whole responsibility over creation. Now the actual meaning, exegetically, is probably much, much nearer to that second one. That's probably what God was meaning in that Genesis passage. But historically, very frequently, as a church, as Christians, we've taken it to mean do whatever you like with. We have dominion. And I think where Lynne White's been kind of responded to, people quite often go back to the exegesis and say, well, it doesn't mean that, it means this. But we also need to look at what they call reception history of texts, how texts have been interpreted over history. Quite often it's been interpreted as do whatever you like with. I'll then just take the other 2 words, which is from Genesis 2, with that wonderful phrase that God put man into the garden to till it and keep it, or to work it and take care of it. And these are 2 really lovely words. Abad means to till, to kind of, if you like, farm or work or serve. It's used also for the Levitical priests when they work in the temple, when they serve in the temple. And some people will say it's actually links then to our kind of worship almost in how we serve God. It's our discipleship to work. And then Shema is also used in the Aaronic blessing. How do we protect or give life to creation? I always think it's got the idea almost like a covering over the top. And you provide that covering to protect creation. And so those 2 words show a lot of how we're called to work in in creation. So just as a summary of Genesis 1 and 2, the idea of creation being good, the fact that we're distinct from creation but also part of it. We are created beings, but we're created in the image of God. And the fact that we're given benevolent rule. We're given this leadership of creation, to use a kind of modern kind of business word, and that our task is to interact, protect, adapt, to aid its fruitfulness. I took this forward in my thesis looking at Isaiah, which I put eventually into a little grey booklet, looking at how how Isaiah, if you like, perceived his environment. So I tried to avoid biblical literalism when you went from, talked about trees clapping their hands, therefore trees clap their hands, saying what was in his brain, what was at the back of his head. It's a geographer's thing of how do you perceive your natural environment. And I used that with the text in Isaiah, and actually came out with quite a strong farming ethic. What you see is actually the idea that humans, through the Hebrew Bible, are given by God to say, yes, work this earth, farm it, use it, develop it, use it for your food, use it for building your houses, but do so in a way that aids its fruitfulness as well as your own. And you see that coming through, and you see that coming through very strongly throughout the Hebrew Bible. So if you think about those types of ethics I was talking about, it's a theocentric ethic. It's not an entirely anthropocentric one. It has got anthropocentric ethics in it, but it's also got some ecocentric and some biocentric. And that's what you find, I think, in the Hebrew Bible, an ethic that's quite holistic, that I think from a deep ecology perspective, they'd be saying, whoa, that's far too anthropocentric. You shouldn't be doing that, you shouldn't be farming. But from, if you like, a 20th century, let's kind of feed the country and plough up the hedges type response, it's a much more ecological ethic than that. So it's a sustainable agriculture ethic, if you like, that you see. I think that's really useful, because I think it's really important, because in the environmental crisis we're in, we're not going to be able to get out of it by actually just standing back from everything. We have to engage, we have to work. And if we, as Christians, saying, well, actually, people are made in the image of God, we have a huge responsibility, particularly for the poorest in the world and the most vulnerable in the world. An ethic that enables to balance human and environmental concerns is an ethic that actually I think is wholly valuable. Then very quickly, some of the other ethics to go through. Incarnation. New Testament environmental ethics tend to go for doctrines rather than the teaching. The New Testament assumes all the teaching of the Old Testament. It's assumed in there. And you can find environmental understanding by looking at some of the basic Christian doctrines. Rowan Williams has recently published on, he's very influenced by Eastern theologians, very strong on incarnation, which is a strong Eastern Christian idea or emphasis, I think probably is a thing, because we all have it studied, but an emphasis. And he starts with incarnation, and he builds an understanding of creation and environment from that. The fact that that Jesus was wholly human, wholly divine, and he works through how does that come together, and this idea of the union of the eternal Logos and the human individual in Jesus Christ comes to then how does that work in terms of how we respond to this material world. I always think that Christianity is actually the most material of any religion, in that we follow a God who was willing to come to earth in Christ, and beyond that to have a bodily resurrection. And if you're interested in resurrection, which I'm not going to go in here, both Richard Borkham and N.T. Wright have a lot about resurrection and the impact of that on environment, the fact that it was a physical bodily resurrection. Now I'm just going to look very briefly at Colossians, which again we had this morning, which again Richard Borkham in his book Bible and Ecology, which if you want a biblical basis for environment, I'd say Richard's is is the best I've come across. It's an excellent introduction to biblical understanding of the environment. And those, my work on Colossians is in those two little booklets. But the idea that Christ was chief over creation, source of all things, this again coming back to intrinsic value of creation, that redemption is built into the fabric of creation, that in terms of at the resurrection, something happened that actually impacted on the whole of creation, and that something is going to happen that impacts on the whole of creation. In Romans 8 it says creation is groaning, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, and that all creation will one day be released from its bondage. This idea that there is something happening to the whole of creation. And that redemption then leads to hope for the whole cosmos. That church and cosmos are connected through Christ, that Christ holds creation. And if Christ holds creation, it says that Christ is the head and we're his body. I know maybe a simple soul, but I think some way that means we're called to be holding creation along with him. We're called to take that seriously. And that is why sometimes it is painful. You look at the pain of this world, but you know that Christ is holding it and we're holding it with him. And that challenges us to be an active partner. We should be active in bringing renewal to this earth, in bringing sustainability, in bringing a different way of being, because that's what we're called to do as Christians. Then very quickly, if you're interested in virtues ethics, another strand of ethics, Ruth Valerio has written on simplicity. I'm sure our crowd who've been doing the work on food would have drawn a lot on Ruth's work. She did her PhD at King's on simplicity and has come to some really profound things and lives it out herself. She lives on a council estate in North Chichester and has been there for many, many years. And then two recent young theologians, Hannah Malcolm, who, if you want to find her talk, it's well worth watching. Just Google her name and Theology Slam. And her talk was based on an idea of solastalgia, the idea of being homesick when you're still at home, and the fact that we need to have some collective grief for the damage to creation, that all too easily we kind of are bright saying, we're Christians, we have hope, let's go for it. But actually we need to have some grief for what has happened. And that's Hannah's. She actually critiqued C.S. Lewis, because he said, well, we're not at home here. That means that we're supposed to be somewhere else. The idea of, again, it's a slightly Platonist idea, or very Platonist idea of a different somewhere heaven. And she's saying, no, actually that's solastalgia. And that's because of what we've done to this creation. We're very much at home in this world. And we need to be working from that. And then Tim Howells, who has also produced a growth booklet. He did his Oxford DPhil on the Anthropocene, and that's his picture. He got his DPhil last Saturday, sent us the picture. It's with his children. And he is again talking about the whole idea of repentance and the idea of apocalyptic, and actually being willing to out of that make a difference, that we as Christians should be working out of a more repentant attitude towards the environment. Then very quickly, to do a little bit of a comparison, and I've taken the two Sant Mir ideas of spiritual motive, ecological motive. As I said, it doesn't mean ecological is not spiritual, but it was trying to sort of say things that would actually make it understanding, because I think quite often there's as much debate within Christianity as between Christianity and other ethics, and there's as much debate within other environmental ethics as there is between. And actually often our call is to collaborate as much as we can. But if you look at the combination between these different ones, if you've got a very spiritualized Christianity that is entirely looking at some other realm, it's going to be quite often looking at anthropocentric or theocentric with an anthropocentric strand. Quite often it will look at this world in terms of its instrumental value. How is it useful? And it can be very confident of use of nature. It will have a concern for the poor, and it will be looking towards a spiritual future. And I'm not saying all is bad, I'm just saying those are some of the features. An ecological ethic will try to combine anthropocentric, ecocentric and biocentric with a theocentric focus, as spiritual would have a theocentric focus. It will try to lead on intrinsic value of nature rather than instrumental value. But it will also have some extrinsic and some instrumental in how it does it. One hopes it will be humble and repentant and concerned for the poor and the planet. And one hopes it will offer hope for a future renewal, which is kind of what we see at those bits I think we were talking about this morning in Isaiah. But we don't quite understand how that works, although I did the other day say, well, look at pandas, they only eat bamboo. How does that happen? So we don't know how it's all going to happen. But that's a sort of hope for a future renewal. And I say it's always dangerous to juxtapose one against the other, but I hope that gives you some idea. Secular environmental ethics, the conservation world are dominantly ecocentric. In fact, the animal welfare world is dominantly biocentric. And that's a very strongly biocentric bit, predominantly also looking at domestic animals, but that's another biocentric world. It's both extrinsic and intrinsic in how it looks at value. What is value? How does actually an ecosystem work together? Extrinsic value, but also having value in its own right, intrinsic value. Predominantly is concern for the poor and the planet, and concern for the future with the potential for a greener, better society. So that's how you might consider all of them. Right, I think I've spoken enough, and I think I'll leave that and ask for questions.